Hello, I'm John Molesky, and this is Wilson Center Now, a production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. I'm joined today by the director of the Mexico Institute, Andrew Rudman, and we have a special guest with us. He is Lorenzo Córdova. Lorenzo is the president councilor of Mexico's National Electoral Institute. We're going to talk today about efforts to reform elections in Mexico and what the implications of those proposed reforms and actual reforms are for Mexican democracy. And Andrew, I thought we'd begin. I know you've been following this story closely, obviously important to all of us here at the Wilson Center and clearly to all of you in Mexico. But I thought we'd begin if you would just do a little scene setting to tell our viewers what we're going to be talking about.
Sure, I'd be happy to. John and President Córdova, great to have you with us today. In really simple terms, John, there was first a proposal to implement a constitutional reform that would have really dramatically changed the way that the INE organizes Mexican elections. The constitutional reform failed. It did not receive a two-thirds majority in the lower house. And so more recently, in December of 22, President López Obrador's party introduced a series of reforms that modify 5 or 6 different laws, in fact, to again change the way that that elections are organized, mostly by cutting INE's budget, both in terms of dollars and in terms of personnel.
And those only needed a simple majority.
And those exactly, that needed a simple majority.
And so the so-called Plan B, I think it was.
Exactly.
Well, and what are the implications?
Well, there are very hard implications because this reform, difference of this series of several reforms that in the 30 past years transform the electoral system and get it stronger and more democratic. The reforms that allowed us to have free and fair elections. This reform is a step back because it's a reform that transforms entirely the way we organize elections and undermine many of the INE's capabilities to organize the elections, and not just in terms of the oversight of the political financiation or to solve the disputes among political parties. No, this is a reform that goes straight to the heart of the INE's capabilities to organize elections and undermine, cutting a huge amount of personnel, for instance, the civil service that is the key bone of the INE, and which until right now is conformed by 2,500 more or less public servants, professional public servants. The reform cuts the 85% of those posts. So the capabilities to organize elections, which is right now not a problem anymore in Mexico, is, I don't know if they aim, but yes, the consequence of these legal reforms. And it's particularly dangerous because if we have solved some problem in Mexico was precisely the capability to organize election in a very complex context because of the criminal presence in some part of the countries, because of the social conflicts or the political conflicts. For instance, in the last 9 years, we've been organizing 331 electoral process as INE, both federal, local, ordinary and extraordinary elections. And no one of those had a post-electoral conflict. So this is the largest period of political stability and democratic governance in all our history. And so the question is why to transform that, especially in a so heavy way, such as the Plan B does.
And that is my question. What is the motivation? What has President AMLO, what have other supporters of the reforms said? What's the problem they've identified that they're trying to fix? Everyone knows that he's had longstanding criticism of the organization, that he's been a sore loser in a close election. And so, how should we interpret what is happening here? Is there a legitimate proposal that addresses identifiable problems, or is this a grudge?
Well, the main paradox is that if there is a political party that has been achieved the existence of trustable rules of an equity competition in elections, is precisely the ruling party, Morena. We are the one, this INE, not other one, who raised the hand to the winner in 2018 elections, which is precisely President López Obrador. The justification is a budgetary justification.
Part of his cost cutting.
Yeah, they used to say, the president used to say that INE is the expensivest EMB in the world, which is not true. That the Mexican elections are the most expensive elections all around the world, which is not true. Yes, we have a very complex electoral system. It costs a lot of money, but you must think that this system is the one we build in order to inoculate, the traditional distrust that characterize, the political attitudes of the political actors in Mexico. So I'd like to say Mexican electoral system is not an expenditure, but it's an investment in order to create political stability and democratic governance. But even if the aim of the reform is to cut costs, that's not true, because how enough money we need to pay, the labor termination of more than thousands of posts, labor posts of public servants, as the reform supposes. So I think that's the public justification. I would not like to think that the real aim is to create a problem in which in something that is already solved. I don't know if they intend to undermine INE's capabilities for being the referee in a very competitive political in an election, in a very close and strained political competitions or something like that. The fact is, anyway, that INE has been under attack from the disqualification from the government in the last years. And the fact is, I think the real reason is that we are a constitutional body of control, political control. And it's clear that in this moment in Mexico, with this huge amount of political power concentration, all the mechanisms of control are not, likely from the government. No.
Mm-hmm. Well, we certainly are understanding of the problem in this country as well.
Yes, indeed.
We have a significant amount of American voters who don't believe the results of the previous election. Yeah. Andrew, I know you have some questions as well.
I do. There are so many. Maybe we should start here, because one of the things I think is really interesting about INE is that it has a role beyond, we think, I think because in the United States, elections are run at the state level, and we really only think about them when they happen.
Yeah.
And so one of the features of INE, which I think is really interesting, is the other services that INE provides. So maybe for those who don't know, maybe you could talk about the issuance of the credentials, and you talked earlier about the even some of the forensic assistance that INE provides.
INE's main task is obviously organize elections both at the federal and the local level, in Mexico. So it's quite the opposite of what happens in the United States. You have a local organization.
We have 50 INEs.
Yes, indeed. You have 50 electoral lists and so on. In Mexico, we follow a different model. We have local management bodies, but they work with the INE and under INE supervision. So the idea was to have the same quality, technical quality, both in federal and local elections. But that's as just Andrew said, is just one of the tasks, the main undoubtedly, but one of the tasks that INE constitutionally have to improve. We also, as we have the national electoral list, we also issue an electoral ID, which it becomes the main ID way to identify us as Mexicans. That also gives us the maintenance and the safeguard of the largest database in the country, including, the biometrical personal data from the Mexican citizens. And that's allowed us to provide several public services, such as, for instance, the authentication mechanism for for instance, bankery transactions. So if you go into a bank in Mexico and you want to make a transaction or change a check or something like that, you must provide your electoral ID, and INE, throughout biometrical measures, can verify that you're the people who claim to be. We also use this database to solve one of the most strengthening problems and that we're facing in Mexico because of the criminal organizations, such as, for instance, identify unidentified bodies throughout the biometrics. We also are responsible for the oversight of any expenditure, income and expenditure in politics. So we are a sort kind of auditing authority that can trespass, for instance, the bank secrecy, bank secret, and so on, in order to inject transparency into political parties' accounts. And finally, we also are responsible for the monitoring. This is strange. We are the only EMB all around the world that has this task on. We monitor every broadcasting, radio and TV broadcasting in the country, in order to guarantee that the prohibitions in our communication model, we have, once again, the opposite model that the one you have in the US. I mean, if you had at the time a Citizens United versus Federal Electoral Commission, such as, the point of reference for the political communication system, in Mexico, it's exactly the opposite. It's forbidden every acquisition of publicity in radio and TV for political purposes. And the political parties uses the public times, as we call it, so they can show their publicity and so on throughout radio and TV to the public. And we are responsible to guarantee that those prohibitions stands up. Therefore, we are the only Mexican state agency that monitors all the broadcastings, and we provide services to other state agencies, by the way, because of that monitoring.
So it's, as you suggested, an expansive agenda of items,
of
way
course.
beyond just managing elections. So when you look at these budget cuts that are being forced upon you, what will give? You can't do it all.
No, not at all. And actually, because of the budget cuts, last year's, we made the first recall at the federal level in our history. This is a very recent figure in the federal level. But for the first time in our entire history, because of the budget cuts that we suffer, we couldn't be able to accomplish what the law mandates to us. We couldn't be able to install all the polling stations for receiving the public opinion about the recall. And that's a problem. Because when you have to do something forced by law, but you cannot accomplish it because you had a budget cut, we have a problem. I mean, there is a sort of contradiction between what the law says and what the institution can do. And it was, by the way, the basis for a constitutional claim, besides the Supreme Court, that give us the reason, but too late because the recall was already done. So yes, we are facing, in Mexico we are facing some phenomena altogether, some phenomena that is happening in many countries. I'm talking about the harassment against electoral institutions coming from the power, or even the government. For instance, the disqualification, the public disqualification coming from the government is not an opposition party that loses an election that claims a fraud. No, it's the government who undermine public trust with critics, many of them false, against the electoral body. In the second place, we've been suffering personal accusations, not just criminal accusations for our job as electoral officials, but also, the menaces from the crowd to come to our homes, or a menace of impeachment procedures against us, because for the decisions we take in our role. In third place, budgetary cuts, and finally, the menace of reforms that undermine our capabilities, institutional capabilities, such as the Plan B has already done. So all these phenomena, which are not exclusively from Mexico, it is happening elsewhere, but they are happening all together in Mexico in this precisely moment.
Andrew, the members of Congress and others have offered at least rhetorical support in questioning some of the reforms and cautioning about their potential negative implications for Mexican democracy. Could you talk a bit about that? And then the other side of that coin, then I'll ask President Córdova to talk about how much U.S. support matters.
Yeah, in fact, there have been two large protests in Mexico. One in November. And one in February last month. And as President Córdova mentioned earlier in a different conversation, it's maybe the first time you've seen a mass protest in favor of an institution, not a march asking for anything in particular or opposing, but really just saying that we want INE, we believe in INE, and I think that's obviously incredibly important and impactful, and I think it gets at the bigger picture, which President Córdova was alluding to, of people's faith in democracy, and the fact that thousands of Mexicans came out in defense of the system, I think indicates that Mexicans do trust INE and do believe firmly that they need a strong INE to guarantee that their votes are counted, that their voices are heard.
And how much does the U.S., the Biden administration or U.S. Congress, how much do they feel they need to monitor this and to say some things that might influence people on the ground in Mexico?
You know, I think the Biden administration has been reluctant to say much. They've been very careful. Some of that is because it's well known that public criticism of the current administration in Mexico generates a very quick and very swift response. And because we have to communicate and cooperate on so many issues, I think the Biden administration, has walked a tightrope. That said, I think that the latest reform, and particularly the reaction in Mexico, has generated more interest, certainly on Capitol Hill, and I think even within the Biden administration, where there is tension over exactly how far to go. Yeah. But I think there is a sense that democracy is a long-held value, and we need to stand up for it, and there's a way to do that. I think, just as I said, the protesters are supporting INE, so it doesn't have to be personal about the president or the president's party. It's just about there should be strong democratic institutions, and those of us who believe in democracy, wherever we are, need to stand up and defend those.
So does it matter to the AMLO administration?
Yes,
does it matter?
Yes. I mean, this is a fight to maintain democracy, Mexican democracy, which is is responsible for ourselves. And by the way, yes, Mexico, which is very peculiar, no, we are under attack. We are under a permanent discredit from in the public discourse from the government. However, INE right now is the civilian institution of Mexican state that has the largest trust among Mexicans. More or less, according to the last polls, 75%.
We have to freeze that moment, because this is unique, not just in Mexico, but in the world.
That's it.
Right now. This is not a time where institutions are held in high regard.
Of course.
So what do you attribute that to?
Well, I want to assume that first.
Sorry, you want to brag, right?
No, not at all.
But
no,
really,
no.
The numbers don't lie.
It was no easy to build trust. You know, the trust building process is very complicated, very slow, and permanent. And if you fail down, I mean, the backslide is tremendous. But I think, I mean, there are some maybe key points to in order to explain what is happening in Mexico with the public trust of through INE. I mean, first of all, I mean, we have done a quite good job. I mean, talking about in a country like Mexico, talking about 9 years of political stability in which the electoral competition is not a problem, is not it's something to take in count.
Well, 20 years, not 9
Well,
years.
actually 20 years, yes, but INE arose from the former IFE 9 years ago. But yes, you're right. In second place, I would like to point that INE, in the last at least 5 or 6 years, deployed a very intense communication logic. I mean, we are very aware of the technical offices, but we assume that in this post-truth context that we're living in all around the world, to have a very assertive, very opportune, very clear communication is fundamental. And mostly when we are being attacked from the governmental circuits. And the real challenge is how to explain without confrontate some party or some government, because we are not part of the political competition. We are the referees of it. In third place, I'd like to say, the ID service that we provide to the Mexican people, it works very well. And it's not just an electoral identification measures. I mean, this is happening
value
every
beyond
day.
voting.
Yeah, beyond voting. That's it. And that creates, a logic of internalization of this institution.
Positive association.
Yes, absolutely. So I think that all these things explains in some way, this a highly amount of public trust that we already gain. But I would like to turn back to the international context.
Yes.
And I think it's very important. These are problems that we should solve by ourselves. This is a Mexican problem. It's a problem of sovereignty. But Andrew has mentioned something which is true. Right now, democracy, American democracy, Mexican democracy, is not just an issue of Americans or of Mexicans. To sustain democracy, to protect democracy, is a worldwide value. And it implies to point attention and to create a context of exigence, which doesn't mean to intervene, there where in which democracy is at risk. For instance, last year's presidential elections in Brazil presented a huge problem. If Brazilian democracy falls down, all the Latin American democracies will have a account to pay. So it's very important for us that Brazilian democracy works well, that Central American countries' democracies works well, and so on. So to be under, the radar of the American political actors, what is happening right now in Mexico, not because we need some kind of intervention, not at all, but that creates a context of exigence. We assume that Mexico is not an island, an isolated island, and know that we have been being watched worldwide. It's very important for us, not just as an institution to be strength, but also for Mexican population to know that they are not alone, and also for the governments that it's a context of exigence. The relationship with the United States is huge, and it's not just political. It's about trade. It's about
every aspect of our
culture
lives.
and so on. That's it. So we are not alone. That's the point, and I think it's very important to point out that we're not alone.
Yeah, this is not just technical.
Yeah, that's it.
This is not. Andrew, what else is on your mind? Because I have a final question I want to ask, but I want to see what else.
Well,
is
maybe there again lots of questions, but. I think I alluded to the fact that you alluded to the fact there will be a Supreme Court challenge.
Yeah.
So maybe you could just talk briefly. I know there are different types of challenges, including some that INE has brought. Do you have a sense of what's the strongest argument against the reform? That is to say, what is the most likely way that the court concludes that?
Yeah. Well, there are two main issues in which the Supreme Court should be pronounced on. The first one is a procedure issue, because in our opinion, all the rules of the legislative process has been broken with the Plan B. For instance, in the lower chamber, since from the presentation of the initiative until the votation passed just 3 hours and a half. 3 hours and a half. You cannot have any discussion, any serious discussion, any democratic discussion, any parliamentary discussion in that that amount of time. Right. Or, for instance, originally the Plan B was a bill presented by the president. But that supposes that you have to pass all the ordinary procedures in the legislative process. And because they intended to do a fast-track legislative process, some representatives copy all the presidential's bill and present it as their own. So, I mean, there are some failures, procedural failures that the Supreme Court has to be pronounced on. If those procedural issues are considered violated by the Supreme Court, all the Plan B falls down because it will be cancelled. And in the other hand, if those compels against the procedure are not successful, the courts should pronounce if the constitutional capabilities of INE in order to organize free and fair, authentic elections are being undermined or not by the law. So it's a constitutional issue. It's the court is called to pronounce itself if the Constitution has been respected or not, or has been alterated by this reform. But I think there are quite good expectations. I'm optimistic, particularly if you take in account some provisional measures that the judges and the justices has already pronounced on. There have been some temporary suspensions on the application of this Plan B, which I mean I think it's the first step in order to an eventual declaration of inconstitutionality, which, I mean, at the end of the day, will provoke that we will go to 24 elections with the same rules that in the last 9 years provide us free and fair elections. Well. Yeah, that's it.
What is the timeline for a Supreme Court ruling?
Well, there is not exactly a timeline, but there is a very important date. The Constitution established that in the 90 days before the electoral process starts, and it will start next September, the 24 elections will start next September, the electoral process, no legal changes can be done. So the magical date is the June the 2nd. So if the Supreme Court has not solved all the issues, but the Plan B is suspended by that date, we will go to the 24 elections with the former rules.
So stay tuned. It's not far away.
No,
not far away. I just want to hear about your trip to D.C. and what you hope to accomplish here, and what kind of meetings you've been having.
Well, it's an ordinary trip. I mean, we have a lot of relationship with several institutions and think tanks and research centers, such as the Wilson Center one. We have regularly relationship with, OES, or in New York with the UN, the United Nations. INE is the EMB that has participated mostly in the last 30 years in technical missions, electoral assistance missions all around the world. Under the coverage of UN or OES, but also we have a very strong relationship with the ones we call our strategic partners, such as the Wilson Center or IFES or CSIS or both the Republican and the Democrat National Institutes and so on. So this is I am at the end of my mandate. I'm still 14 days more before I end a long 9 years term. And this is the last chance to me to have these meetings in order to thank all the work we have done together, but also to reassure that despite the natural changes in the directive body, in its directive body, the General Council, this relationship will stand on in the future.
Well, thank you very much, both of you, for this important discussion. You know, we're nonpartisan, as you are here at the Wilson Center, but that doesn't mean you can't be pro-democracy, right?
Yeah, that's it.
That's right. Gentlemen, thank you very much.
On the contrary, thank you so much.
Thank you.
We hope you enjoyed this edition of Wilson Center Now, and that you'll join us again soon. Until then, for all of us at the Center, I'm John Milewski. Thanks for being here.